Okay, let's talk joints. So first thing we're going to need to do is go into rigging mode up here, drop down into rigging, and that will give us the skeleton option up here. If I click on the dotted line, you can see the dotted line here. That rips away any menus. I'm just going to keep this one open for a minute. And first thing to note is I'm in my 4-panel view. Press spacebar in any of these and it opens it up as a whole. And that's because generally when you're creating joints, you can't create them in perspective mode and have any kind of understandable success. You'll see that those joints are just created in perspective mode. It looked as though we were creating them in one plane, but actually it was creating them flat on the floor, which isn't what we want at all. The way to control it is to have your window set to an orthographic view. So I'm at the front view, and we're going to create some joints. I just opened the options here, and they're not appearing on either of my screens. I'll try double clicking here. Nope. That is not an option for me. Probably something relating to this workspace being a bit messed up. If I pop into rigging and click it, there we go. So they do exist. Mine is just having an off day. So these are our joint settings. There's a bunch of things you can have in here. The only one we'll turn on and off is projected centering. We don't have a mesh that we're working with, so we can't use that. But when you have a mesh, you can select in the perspective view the mesh. So it could be the elbow. You could try placing it there, and it will try to position the joint in the center of the mesh, which is really handy, and we may look at later. For now, however, we're going to keep these like this, fairly straightforward, and create some joints. So let's go into my front view, and I am going to create a joint chain. So 1, 2, 3, and if I press enter, that completes the tool, and they are my joints. If I click W here, it will show you which way these are pointing. Now, you need to check this, because if your move tool, this guy over here, if you double click him, if he is set on world, no matter what joint you select, it will always have Y pointing up and X will always point in the same direction. And that is not oriented to the direction of these joints. If I move this guy here and then press move again, you'll see how it's no longer pointing down the joint, which is a problem when we come to rotations. If this is also in world mode, I now cannot make that joint twist. So I guess this would be the axis I'd need to twist it on, and now it's rotating in 2 different axes. Whereas if I put this into object, I can now twist this. So make sure whenever you go to create and move your joints that you actually double click on the move tool that you're using, whether it's translate or rotation, and just make sure that you know what mode it's in. There are times when you need one or the other. But if you don't know where that is, then you're going to be in trouble. So I should reset all of that. And these are my joints. Now, I'm going to turn this into a kind of a finger and wrist kind of setup. So if I go back into my front view and I create some more joints, I can show you a little bit more about how joints work. So let's say like shoulder, elbow, wrist, and now we want to make some fingers. I have my joint tool, and I could try to just immediately come off this wrist, or I could make an entirely new independent joint chain It's a very long-fingered person, by the way. And if I press enter, it completes the tool. But if I press up and down on the, literally the up and down keys, I can go up and down these joints. And if I go back to this joint, I can carry on making chains. You may find there are situations where that's super useful. In this instance, it's entirely useless. So we're actually going to kill that. But I wanted to show you this this kind of way of approaching creating joints, because a lot of people work this way. There's a certain amount of cleanliness that you can have from creating your joint chains separated and then connecting them up after. So what you'll see here is if I select this finger joint, then shift select my wrist joint, I can go up to my parent menu, and if I create a parent, it actually connects those joints up exactly the same way as if I had just created that as one continuous joint chain, as I'll demonstrate now. So exactly the same kind of way of working. However, you'll notice that the wrist here, if I go out of world, the wrist orientation here is very different because of the way it's trying to align itself. And that's because I parented to the wrist rather than doing it in one consistent joint chain. Neither's right or wrong. They both need fixing one way or another, but it's important to show you these ways of working. And it becomes super important when it comes to creating humans, because if I just create my spine here, I might come straight off and into my arms like so. And oh, I could also then go into my neck and head, but I can't carry this on when it comes to the legs. You notice which way these are pointing. So parent, this controls everything. This one controls everything above it, and this above it, and this one, and that one, and that one. If I then go and create legs like so, we can end up, actually I did it perfectly. If you're not paying attention to the direction of flow, is the thing to note here. Like if you started, for instance, right at the bottom and worked your way up like so and created this person, you end up with a certain kind of flow which may be useful for one thing you're doing, but it certainly won't be useful for if you're creating a human. Because for a human, you need the legs to be able to rotate like so. So if I grab the hip and I swing the hip, the knee follows, then the ankle follows, and then the rest of the foot. If you're not paying attention to the flow of your joints, then if I take this second example where I started at the bottom and worked my way up, I grab the foot and everything follows. And that is not how the pelvis works. You get the upper half kind of working okay, but then you can't just grab the hip and move the leg. It would actually move everything above it. So one of the things that people do quite often is they will, and I'm well aware that I'm making lots of terribly deformed humans here. We'll clear them all up in a minute. But one of the things that people do regularly is they will make separate chains and parent them all up afterwards. Which is why I was showing you the fingers in the first place. And this way you can control the flow and keep things nice and tidy. But it's a choice. Neither is right or wrong. As you can see from these two, they both produce more or less exactly the same results. and they actually both have exactly the same issues. So that's creating joints. We want to move on to actually making these joints behave in the way that we want to. So if I grab these and have a look at where they are facing, they're actually behaving themselves quite well. What I'm looking for here is I'm looking for this red axis, the X axis. X, Y, and Z goes red, green, and blue. It's just something that you commit to memory eventually and remember. But what I want is for the red axis to always point towards the next joint down. So that's known as X down the bone. So if I make these arrows smaller, you can see that this is perfectly pointing towards the next joint. And that's actually fine. And beyond that, what we've also got is this blue axis. So that would be the axis that I rotate like so. So the bending of the fingers. That is also very consistent. All of them seem to be pointing in the same axis, which is the behavior that we'd like from this. So we're fortunate there, but it's not the end of the story. Let's say, for instance, that I don't particularly want these to be bending exactly straight like this. Perhaps these fingers are actually, if we had the mesh, they could be bent a little bit kind of to the side. So actually what I want is for this to bend more in that kind of axis rather than in that axis. Now, what you don't want to do is just rotate these joints to how you want them to bend. Because as soon as it comes to attaching anything else further to your skeleton, i.e. making a rig, the first thing that happens is it spots over here in your channel box that you have got something other than 0 in one of your rotation axes, and that just destroys all things relating to rigging. One of the easiest examples is when you're rigging, you put something in T-pose, and that is your kind of neutral pose. If you have values there and you somehow manage to rig that, when you go to put it back into its neutral pose, the T-pose, its neutral pose is not at 0. So it will reset everything to 0. And where you're expecting a T-pose, it could end up with one arm sticking up in the air, which is not desirable. So we don't want to just rotate this joint into the direction it's going to go and then just leave it like that. That can cause all sorts of problems. People often say when you're rigging, like, you never rotate joints. If they're not in the right place, you find another way of correcting that. So you could say this joint, for instance, perhaps I need to edit it. Instead of, say for instance, it needs to have a bend in it like this to more accurately represent the finger curvature. If I rotate it like that, then those rotational values are stored, and that's a problem for rigging. What people will often do is grab the joint that needs to move, go into the Move tool, and we'll open up the settings, and in here there's a thing called Preserve Children. If you click this, you can move the joint and it does not affect anything else attached to it. So in this case, the fingertip. So I could put my bend into that finger like so. And you might very well be thinking, huzzah, you've solved it. Look, everything is at 0. That's great. However, now look at where this is facing. This X does not point down the bone, and neither does this. And I will double check that I'm not in world. I'm not in world. So now, because you've moved where the joint is, however, the orientation is still facing the direction it was before, it no longer will rotate in the right direction. And this is a real problem. Normally, when we have joint chains, we fix their orientations by going to this little menu here. So in skeleton, and we want orient joint. And we will take off orient to world because that puts everything pointing up and to the side according to world space. We don't want that. So what we would normally do is come in here and have a look at these options. By default, I think orient children is on. So what this is asking you, it can be very confusing, but it's asking you which axis is your main axis, so your kind of primary axis. And you can just play with these. You don't necessarily need to understand it or remember it, as long as you're consistent. Now, most people that I come across in rigging and animation expect that X will point down the bone. It kind of doesn't matter, but because it's a fairly typical standard, it makes sense to give people the kind of thing that they're expecting when they're doing any technical work with it. So I always stick with X down the bone. My secondary axis, which I have here, is Y. How about I just click apply and you can have a look. So now you can see what that does. That makes X point down the bone on this joint and on this joint. It doesn't change the location of the joint. It just sorts out the weird orientation issues. And as my second axis is Y, that's the green axis, this one here, that will also consistently point out to the side, whilst the blue one would be the impossible, so the Z axis is the impossible axis, which would break your finger if you bent in it. Now it's done it for this joint, but this end joint doesn't have a joint to point towards, so it's slightly different behavior. But we can have a look here. So I have X, Y, and then X. Now if I put Y as my secondary world axis orientation, it now has slightly different behavior, and Z slightly different behavior again. So you can kind of play around with these settings and change the way that it's orienting this joint according to what better suits you. The trick, or the key, should I say, is that whatever you do, keep it consistent. One of the main reasons for this is you give this to an animator and they're used to X twisting a bone and Z being the one that bends the bone in its primary axis. If it's a hinge joint like an elbow or a knee that only really moves in one axis apart from the twist, which the joint doesn't really do the twist, but nonetheless, they're the two axes that it will be bending in. You want them to be consistent so that the animator can work faster. And also, if you grab both arms and you move them both in the Z axis, for instance, they don't go in opposite directions. They actually both go up. So one will go in positive, one will go in minus, perhaps, depending on your joint structure. But you just want to make sure it's consistent, which is why you can play around with these orient joint settings to begin with, and then keep it consistent and check it. Make sure that your joints are actually behaving the way that you want. So I have put this as my joints. So let's say I select right at the bottom and click apply. And now what I'm looking for, if I show my entire hierarchy, so I have everything selected individually, then I can, from within my orient joint options, click toggle local rotation axes, and it will show you where everything is pointing. And you can also do this in display. Is it animation joint size? Okay, I forget where this is. Transform display. You can also do that in here. So you can toggle rotation axes on and off, or whatever joints you have selected. I find it easier inside of the orient joint options. I always remember that one. So with this, I don't have to have them selected anymore. I can always see which way they're pointing. And what you can see is X points down the bone on all of these. Z is the main one that we'll be using to actually do our main finger movement. Given that most of them are hinge joints, the top finger joint is a little bit more dexterous, so it's actually got degrees of freedom in all three axes. Well, it doesn't have much of a twist, but it actually has more freedom than your typical hinge joint. But what we can see is that these are now consistent, and that is okay. That is fine, apart from one of them, which is actually wrong. That would be this guy here. That's our wrist. Our wrist is now currently pointing towards one of our fingers. So if I rotate my wrist, it rotates at a wonky angle, and we don't want that. So we could, if I'm actually going to take these joint rotations off now. So select hierarchy. You can also access that in the main menu here, select and then hierarchy. And I'm going to toggle those rotation axes off. So I could take both of these children, of the wrist and go edit, unparent, or shift and P. And if I then orient this joint to the world, it will point straight up. So now when I look at it, that's a far more logical direction for my wrist to point. So I could do that. I don't know why I undid. Let's orient to world. And then if we grab these guys again and parent them back to the wrist is now pointing in a direction that we like. That's one way of doing it. You could also, if I grab these again and unparent, shift P, I could set my direction of travel for my wrist by creating another joint. And this will be a joint that I use as a look at. So if I come back into my front view and I create a joint and I want it to be here, and then shift select this guy here and parent. This wrist now orients itself to face the direction of that joint. So if I toggle on my local rotation axes, we can see that this is now adopting the same behavior as these other fingers, but actually pointing in a way that's logical. So I can now get these guys and parent them back. And I no longer need this. And we have a wrist that is rotating exactly how we want it to, and fingers that are rotating exactly as we want it to. So that's job fairly well done, I might say. It's not necessarily the end of the story. There is one more trick that I think you could do with knowing, and that is similar to what you can do with your orientation settings when you're playing around with them. Now, what do I have here? This. I'll go back into my general view. So this is, are these oriented? Let's orient them. Something has non-zero rotations. Where is it? This guy. Oh, that's a translate. It's not that guy. this guy here. Okay. Let's try this again. So remember earlier I said if you don't have 0 on all of your joints in their rotation, it can cause problems. There's a prime example. Okay, so I have applied that. Let's select the hierarchy and have a look at what's going on here. Okay, so X down the bone, Z as the secondary, and Y all pointing the same way. Beautiful, nice and tidy. Now then, let's just say that this is a bit wonky, and actually what we want is this finger chain. We actually want it to be rotating more kind of at that angle. And we can play with the orient joint settings and see if one of them actually comes close, but it's unlikely to. So if we play with these a little bit more, now we're getting very, very similar results. So I think we will have to go with my original thoughts. Yeah, okay. Cool. Oh, I had Y and then Z. Yes. Okay. So we want this to rotate at a different angle than what it is currently. So let's say it's kind of there. So maybe this is a thumb and this is a finger, and they often don't align in the same way. So we need it to rotate differently than what it's currently set up as, and even though we've put the joints in the right location, they're still rotating off. Now, I could rotate it into the position I want, and then come up to my Modify tab, and come to Freeze Transformations. And where we have a dirty -28 over here, if we freeze our transforms, we reset that to 0. And now our 0 for this joint is actually in the location that we want it to. We've already oriented it correctly, so it rotates the right way. It's all nice and clean and tidy. All the axes are okay. However, it's now rotating from a slightly different location or a different pivot because we've kind of brute forced it into behaving the way that we want it to. So this technique is quite fast and effective. It works most of the time. It's not perfect. If we open up our attribute editor, you can see that even though we have used freeze transform to reset these all to 0, all these rotations, Maya remembers. It knows that its orientation is slightly different. Like, this isn't at 0. It knows that its orientation is different to what it's displaying as 0. It usually doesn't cause a problem. And sometimes in rigging, you kind of just have to take educated gambles, and quite often that technique will work fine. If I undo, go back to a time when it was oriented in a way we didn't want. So now it should, if I select both of these, okay, they're rotating from the same direction, and that was what we didn't want. So another way of doing a similar thing is coming into our orient joint options, and we're not even doing anything with the actual click apply button. What we're going to do is make sure we toggle on the rotation axes, and we're going to click on modify. And then now when I'm rotating this joint, you can see that it's not actually rotating it in a conventional way, because all of these children above it aren't being affected. But if I say yes, that's the direction I want it to rotate from and then freeze it, it then corrects the orientation. And you can see now it's rotating from the direction it wants to. Now, I'm not going to say it's better than the other method of freezing the transforms, because it's almost the same thing. As soon as you click freeze, it performs a similar operation to us moving the joint and then freezing the transforms. It's very, very similar. And if I bring up my attribute editor, it still has these dirty things underneath, but it's a process that Maya is handling itself, so potentially more stable. Potentially. What you'll also notice, and this is where this is more likely to be useful, is that it only affected that one singular joint. It didn't rotate the whole joint chain. If I demonstrate with the joint above, if I move this one, you notice how it's moving everything underneath it, or above it, but underneath in the hierarchy. If we don't want all of them to be affected, so say for instance it was just this knuckle that we didn't like the rotation of it, we can click the modify button, change its direction, and then freeze it, and it will only affect that joint there. So this joint now, this whole thing is a mess. So if I select all of these joints individually, so this joint, and that joint, and we go to rotate them all in the blue axis, the first two are actually following exactly the same, but because we've edited this this axis on this knuckle here, his blue axis is skew if compared to the others, so it ends up looking a little bit funky. But you might need that. The thumb is a great example of this. Often when you put the joints into the thumb isn't spread out like my hand is. The thumb is often slightly set down below because we have a kind of, well, the opposable part of our opposable thumb allows it to sit underneath or sit flat. And quite often you will get hands that are modeled in such a way that the thumb is actually sitting underneath the hand, and you will need to edit the rotation of that joint as well as making sure that the rest of the thumb joints are just hinge joints. So you may need to edit just one, and that would be probably useful in that situation. So neither of them are 100% perfect, but they generally work, and they work in slightly different ways in slightly different circumstances. But it should be enough to get you set up making joint chains that rotate in the right direction and don't have a bunch of dirty numbers attached to them. But yeah, we'll build on this in the next video, and hopefully that helps you in setting some standard joint chains up. Cool, take care.